They didn't wear armor, they didn't fear death, and before battle they would howl, bite their shields, and foam at the mouth. These were the Berserkers, Viking shock troops who entered a trance-like fury so terrifying even their comrades kept their distance. Dressed in bear or wolf skins, they believed they were possessed by animal spirits. Legend says they felt no pain, couldn't be stopped, and killed everything in their path. Some believe it was drugs. Others say it was pure madness. But whatever the cause, when Berserkers entered the battlefield, enemies fled before a sword was even raised. But what were these legendary warriors actually like? How did they fight? And why should you care about them today? Hello, and welcome to this channel. I'm your host. The term Berserker comes from Old Norse and literally means bear skin. This is because the elite Viking shock troops wore the skins of bears or wolves as they charged into battle. These ferocious fighters were said to have been so terrifying that just the sight of them was enough to make their enemies break and run. During the Viking Age, which lasted from the 8th to the 11th century, the Scandinavian raiders, traders, and explorers were known as the Vikings. Although traditionally they are remembered for their fierce fighting skills and bloodlust, in reality, most Vikings were farmers or traders. However, a small percentage of men were warriors who fought for the glory of their chief, as part of a war band. These elite soldiers would take part in raids, either attacking coastal settlements or on other ships out at sea. When the time came for battle, some of these Viking warriors would transform themselves into terrifying beasts, becoming Berserkers. Historians believe the Berserkers were part of a larger group of elite Viking warriors called the Varangians. The word Varangian itself means foreign, specifically referring to Vikings who traveled east into the territories of the Slavic peoples and the Byzantine Empire. Many Vikings joined the Byzantine army, either as mercenaries or as part of a tribute demanded by the emperor. In exchange for their service, the Vikings were paid well and given plunder taken from the enemies of the empire. Over time, the Byzantines took on more and more Vikings, creating a professional elite military force. These elite soldiers were deployed throughout the empire and were used to put down rebellions, secure borders, and fight in the numerous wars the empire was involved in. As one example, the Varangian Guard was a prestigious unit that guarded the emperor and his court. They were renowned throughout the medieval world for their fierce loyalty, martial prowess, and ability to endure hardship. What's interesting here is that we see the origins of the term Berserker. From an Old Norse poem called the Famskladolf, we get the first written reference to a berserker. It goes as follows. A shield was hanging on the wall, adorned with serpents and wolves, and beside it stood a spear. Whoever, therefore, shall dare to wield that spear, let him be a berserker, fierce and bold. So the name referred to any elite warrior who donned bear or wolf skins as they went to battle. It also seems likely that the word berserker was used to refer to those Vikings who were part of the Varangian army. It wasn't long before tales of these ferocious fighters spread throughout Europe. Legends grew of their superhuman abilities, claiming they could enter a berserker rage, a trance-like state in which they became unstoppable killing machines. According to these legends, berserkers exhibited animal-like characteristics. They growled and snarled, foamed at the mouth, and their eyes flashed with an eerie light. During the berserker rage, pain meant nothing to these warriors, and they continued to fight until either their enemies were dead or they were too exhausted to continue. But how did the berserkers enter this state? Some historians believe that certain herbs and plants may have been used to induce a drug-induced frenzy. Other scholars point to a primitive form of hypnosis as a possible cause, with warriors staring directly at their shields while biting their shields to produce a hypnotic effect. Finally, others have suggested that the berserker rage was simply a heightened emotional and physical state, brought on by extreme adrenaline and testosterone levels during battle. Whatever the cause, the effect was the same. The berserkers became frenzied killers, terrifying all who witnessed their rage. As terrifying as these legendary fighters sound, their violent outbursts could turn against the Vikings themselves. Sometimes fellow Viking warriors got caught up in the berserkers' rage and died as a result. Because of this danger, many Vikings tried to avoid fighting berserkers even though they were on the same side. The last recorded use of the term berserker can be found in the 13th century, in a saga describing the battle between King Sverre of Norway and his opponents. As Sverre's forces advanced on the town of Bergen, his shield-bearing berserkers went before him, striking terror into the hearts of the townspeople. Once inside the settlement, they unleashed their fury on the townspeople, killing everyone in their path. When they finally finished their rampage, there was not a single survivor left in Bergen. After this, the term berserker disappeared, perhaps falling victim to the same fate as the Vikings themselves. As time went on, their way of life gradually faded, and the stories of their accomplishments were passed down through history. Today, berserkers are remembered as some of the fiercest fighters in history, so what do you think? Do you believe these legendary warriors really existed? Or are they nothing more than a myth? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching. Ivar the Boneless, the cruelest Viking who ever lived. Ivar was feared not just for his mind, but for his body, or lack thereof. Some said he had a disease that made his bones soft. Others whispered he could slither like a snake and strike just as fast. What's not in doubt is his cruelty. After his father, Ragnar, was killed, Ivar vowed revenge and burned cities to the ground across England. He didn't just kill kings, he made them suffer. The great heathen army he led was one of the largest Viking forces ever assembled. And at its head was a man they called Boneless, but there was nothing soft about Ivar's wrath. This is the story of Ivar the Boneless. In 865 AD, Ivar the Boneless became the king of the Viking kingdom of Northumbria. At the time, the Northumbrian kingdom was one of the richest in all of England, but it would be the last kingdom to fall under the rule of the Vikings. The story of how Ivar seized the throne is a brutal one. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a text written by monks, Ivar and his two brothers, Hubba and Emma, slaughtered King Osbert and his entire royal line, then forced the citizens of Northumbria to crawl through the streets while they looted their homes. There are two versions of what happened next. One says that Ivar and his brothers took turns raping a noblewoman named Odd, so enraged that she cursed the three of them, predicting that they would all die horrible deaths. The other version has Ivar breaking into Odd's chambers only to find her asleep and taking her life by slitting her throat. Either way, Odd's brother, Ethelstan, swore revenge. But when he confronted Ivar, the new king of Northumbria, he too was killed. According to legend, Ivar now turned his attention to the kingdom of Mercia, where he was met by a Mercian army led by King Bergerd at the Battle of the River So. Ivar's forces, which included soldiers from Denmark and Sweden, were vastly outnumbered, but they won the day thanks to a surprise attack by Ivar's elite guard, the Shield Wall. What followed was one of the most ruthless sieges in history. Ivar divided his forces into three groups, each given the task of killing everyone in the city. The first group set fire to the buildings. As people fled, the second group killed them. And the third group, Ivar's personal guard, pillaged the city, taking whatever they wanted back to their ships. They left behind only one survivor, an old man who was blinded and deaf. Ivar's reputation as a merciless conqueror continued to grow. In 869 AD, he and his half-brother, Halfdan Ragnarsson, led a Viking army to the kingdom of East Anglia. The local king, Edmund, known as Edmund the Martyr, refused to pay the Vikings a protection fee. So, Ivar and Halfdan marched on the capital and laid siege to the city. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the Vikings built a massive rampart around the city to keep its inhabitants from leaving. Then they set up camp outside and waited for Edmund to starve. When the city fell, Ivar and his men went on a 3-day rape and murder spree. And when they were done, they chopped down Edmund's head and threw it in the river. Now, because of the brutality of these raids, Ivar earned a reputation as a merciless tyrant. And yet some historians have challenged this image of him. Recent studies have suggested that the contemporary accounts of Ivar's reign may have been exaggerated for political purposes, and that Ivar's record may have been purposefully tarnished by his enemies after he usurped Northumbria's throne. These scholars point out that Ivar established a legal code and minted his own coins, which suggests he was a ruler more interested in establishing a legitimate government than burning cities to the ground. But whether he was a merciless tyrant or a misunderstood leader, Ivar the Boneless died a horrible death, just as Odd had predicted. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, he contracted a mysterious illness on a campaign in the west of England, one that made his legs black and swollen. He died shortly after, and with him, the kingdom of Northumbria would eventually be reclaimed by the English. But the damage that Ivar inflicted on England would never be forgotten. His raids across the country helped pave the way for the Danish invasion of England in the 9th century, and his legacy lived on in stories and songs for centuries to come. So what really happened to Ivar the Boneless? Was he a vicious killer or a misunderstood leader? Let me know your thoughts. Thank you for watching. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already. And thanks to our supporters for making videos like this one possible. Hey, friends. History's most feared warriors are often larger-than-life figures like Richard the Lionheart or Genghis Khan. They're towering heroes whose deeds of daring do have inspired countless poems and songs. But sometimes it was the smaller, uglier warriors who made the biggest impact. That's why we've brought you this series, Small But Mighty Warriors, where we shine a light on some of history's most fearsome fighters who might have lacked in size but more than made up for it in skill and ferocity. And today we're going big, all 4'11" of him, with one of history's deadliest Vikings, Egill Skallagrimsson. Egill didn't look like a hero. Born misshapen and angry, he killed his first man at age 7, so Egill was obviously a child of prophecy. The gods had plans for him, and those plans involved lots of screaming, drinking, fighting, and dying. By adulthood, he was feared across the north, a brutal berserker who fought for the highest bidder. And make no mistake, Egill was a monster on the battlefield. Once he gouged out a man's eye with his teeth during a fight in Sweden. The story goes that afterwards he spit the eye into the crowd, hit a young girl in the head and killed her. No, thanks, Egill. It wasn't just his ferocious fighting skills that made him so terrifying. It was also the way he wielded his words. A brilliant poet, Egill was known to compose vicious curses that would drive his enemies to madness or death. One such curse is supposedly what earned him the nickname Skallagrimsson, which translates roughly to Shriek of the Tomtit. According to legend, while fighting alongside his brother in Norway, they found themselves under attack by a large group of well-armed men. Though the two brothers managed to slay many of their attackers, they were eventually surrounded and forced to flee. As they ran, Egill turned to his brother and composed a taunting song about how they'd been bested by a bunch of soft little boys. The song was so insulting that their pursuers burst out laughing and forgot all about trying to kill them. Egill's ability to turn the tide of battle with his tongue as well as his sword was put to the ultimate test. However, during a trip to Ireland, as the story goes, Egill had gotten himself sentenced to death. We're not sure what he did to incur the wrath of the local chieftain. All we know is that he woke up one morning to find himself in an iron chest with only a stone to his name. The plan was that he would be left to die of starvation, and the chieftain's daughter was tasked with making sure he didn't escape, but Egill had other plans. As the daughter approached the chest, he began to compose a poem praising her beauty, and when she leaned in to hear him better, he finished the poem and added a couple of extra verses insulting her intelligence. This enraged the woman, who ran off to tell her father that Egill had insulted her. The chieftain invited Egill out of the box, listened to his poem, and was impressed by his skill. Instead of chopping off Egill's head, he set him free and gave him a boat and some supplies so he could go home. So, yeah, Egill was kind of a jerk. But if you want to survive a trip to Ireland in the 8th century, you gotta do what you gotta do. Although Egill was clearly a force to be reckoned with, it's possible that he might have exaggerated his accomplishments a bit. Historians believe that Egill's saga, like many others from this time period, was written to glorify the warrior's deeds. Since most of what we know about Egill comes from these poems and songs, it's tough to separate fact from fiction. But there's no denying that Egill was a legendary warrior, even if he wasn't the most pleasant guy to hang out with. After all, it takes a special kind of monster to strike fear into the hearts of his enemies with both his bare hands and his beautiful poetry. Maybe don't invite him to your next dinner party, but if you find yourself cornered by a band of angry Irishmen, maybe you should call him. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, check out our series, Small But Mighty Warriors, for more stories of history's tiniest titans. And come back next week for more mini-historical tales. See you then. Hardrada, King of Norway from 1046 to 1066, died at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066. This battle is considered the end of the Viking Age. It's me. Welcome to my channel. Today we are going to meet a king, a legendary Viking warrior king. Before he was a king, Harald was a teenager watching his brother die in battle. He fled, but not for peace. He became a mercenary in Byzantium. There he grew up, becoming a giant in height and a giant in battle prowess, a reputation soaked in blood. They called him the Hard Ruler, and when he returned home, he ruled like fire. He pillaged England, France, Ireland, and Scotland. Returning home, he lavished gold on his people, scars on his body, and stories on his mind that would turn into legend. His death is considered the end of the Viking Age, but until his last breath, Harald was a storm. Loud, ruthless, and impossible to ignore. Hardrada means hard ruler. It's a name that fits perfectly on a king whose ambition knew no bounds, a man who lived to fight and lead his people to greatness. In 1046, Harald inherited the Norwegian throne from his father, Olaf the Peaceful. The young king continued his father's policy of expanding the realm through diplomacy, but he also prepared for war, training an army and building a navy. In 1051, he conquered Denmark, ending the rule of the Danish king Svein Estridsson. Then he set his sights on England. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tells us about the terror Hardrada brought upon England. In 1066, he led an army of 300 ships and between 5,000 and 7,000 men to the north of England. There he met the English army led by King Harold Godwinson. The two armies clashed at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. The Anglo-Saxons won the battle and Hardrada died, pierced by a Saxon spear. But before his death, he had carved his name in blood and fire across Europe. And now let me tell you those stories. When Hardrada was 13 years old, his brother and king, Olaf the Beautiful, died in battle against the Danish king Svein Estridsson. Hardrada fled to Sweden, where he spent some time before heading to the Byzantine Empire. There he offered his services to the emperor and became a member of the elite imperial bodyguard. In exchange, the emperor gave him a noble title and a small estate. During his time in Byzantium, he learned the art of war and made a fortune. Sources differ on the length of his stay in Byzantium, but most agree it was about 5 years. While there, he distinguished himself as a fierce warrior and earned the nickname Hardrada, which means hard ruler in Old Norse. After returning to Scandinavia, he married a princess from the kingdom of Hliam, and together they had 2 children. After conquering Denmark, he turned his attention back to Norway and became involved in a succession dispute in 1046. He deposed his nephew, the young king of Norway, and took the throne for himself. From that moment, he ruled like a god over his people. Harald Hardrada pillaged England, France, Ireland, and Scotland, bringing untold riches back to Norway. He raided monasteries and churches, taking whatever valuables he could find. He was also known for his brutality, killing everyone in his path who didn't submit to him. One of his most famous exploits was the sack of the monastery at Lindisfarne in 1066. There he found a giant cauldron filled with gold and silver coins. According to legend, he emptied the cauldron and distributed the treasure to his men, and that's how they earned the nickname the Hard Ruler. He loved his people and wanted them to prosper. He used his wealth to build schools, churches, and hospitals. Under his reign, Norway became a major power in Europe. He was also a patron of the arts and literature, and many of the old Norse poems and songs were written during his reign. But he will be remembered for his military campaigns. He loved to fight and lead his people into battle. He was a brilliant strategist and tactician, and his army was one of the most feared in Europe. He was also a skilled sailor, and his navy dominated the North Sea. When he died at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, it marked the end of an era in European history. The Viking Age had come to an end. His death also had a profound impact on England. It paved the way for the Norman conquest of England in 1066, which would have a lasting impact on the English language, culture, and society. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a thumbs up. Subscribe if you want more episodes like this. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Leif Eriksson's sister, daughter of Eric the Red, granddaughter of the legendary Ivar the Boneless, niece of King Harald Bluetooth of Denmark, Freydis was a Viking princess. She had fame and fortune handed to her on a platter, or at least she could have. But it wasn't enough for her. She wanted more. And in the year 999 AD, she set sail for the far-off shores of Vinland, North America, with a fleet of ships and an army of 300 men. When the native warriors attacked, most of the Viking men ran away. So when Freydis got off her ship to relieve a wounded comrade, she noticed that he was clutching a sword. So, as the natives closed in, she grabbed the sword and charged forward, just as she had seen her father do many times before. To her surprise, the men of Vinland weren't used to seeing a heavily pregnant woman covered in tattoos, screaming and frothing at the mouth as she came at them with a sword. They turned tail and fled. And that is how Freydis, daughter of Eric the Red, proved herself to be a shield maiden of Vinland. But the story of Freydis is one of those tales that sticks in the minds of men like burrs in their beards. For when her expedition partner Thorkell suggested that they should settle down in Vinland and start a new life there, she ordered him and his entire crew put to death. So what was it that drove this woman to carve her name into Viking history? Was it ambition or madness? Or perhaps both? Welcome to my channel. Today we'll explore the tale of blood and iron of Freydis, the daughter of Eric the Red. Eric the Red was already a legend in his own right when Freydis was born in Iceland around the year 970. His father was Thorvald, the chieftain of a small clan in northern Europe, while his mother was the Danish princess, Queen Gunhild. So with such powerful blood flowing through her veins, it's no wonder that Freydis was destined for greatness. At age 16, she married a man named Thorir, who became the chief of the western settlements in Greenland. Together they had 2 sons. But while living in relative peace in Greenland, her father, Eric, was banished for manslaughter after killing a rival chieftain in a fit of rage. When Eric was exiled, he took his family with him, settling in a remote part of southern Greenland where he built a farm. Not long after, Thorir also died, leaving Freydis a widow at the ripe young age of 21 as a newly minted chieftainess. She took her 2 young sons and sailed to the kingdom of Norway to seek the protection of her uncle, King Olaf Tryggvason. While in Norway, Freydis converted to Christianity, although she never renounced her old Norse pagan beliefs. It was in Norway that she met her second husband, a man named Ivar a Danish earl. Once again, fate smiled on Freydis as Ivar was granted the title of Jarl of all of northern Denmark by King Olaf, making her Lady Freya de Zol. But just as her first marriage was a happy one, her second husband's brother, King Sweyn Forkbeard, went and died. And according to the laws of first cousins marrying, Ivar became king. So now Freydis was queen, but it wasn't enough for her, she wanted more. In the year 999, her father, Eric the Red, set sail for the coast of North America, having discovered it on a previous voyage. Eric called it Vinland because he found wild grapes growing there. Now Eric wanted to establish a settlement and claim the land for the King of Norway. So he gathered 300 men and set sail for the New World, his daughter and her husband, the royal couple of Denmark, sailing alongside him. The natives of Vinland were fierce warriors, however, and when they attacked the Norsemen, most of the men ran away, leaving Freydis ashore with a small group of injured Vikings. According to the saga, when the natives closed in on her and her companions, one of the men fell to his knees and pulled a sword from the slain. When Freydis saw this, she grabbed the sword and, despite being 8 months pregnant, charged out of the Viking boats and onto the beach, where she hacked and slashed at the stunned natives until they fled. That day, Freydis proved herself to be a shield maiden of Vinland. But a few years later, when Eric the Red proposed that they return to Greenland, she ordered him and the rest of the expedition partners killed in cold blood. Except for one, a man named Thorkell, whom she spared so that he might tell the tale of Vinland to the people of Denmark. What drove her to do such a thing? Ambition, madness, or perhaps both. But either way, Freydis carved her own name into Viking horror stories, not with a pen, but with a sword. So what should we talk about next? Please let me know in the comments section below. And remember to subscribe for new episodes every week. Thanks for watching. Over 6 foot 6 inches, almost 7 foot tall. It is hard to imagine a human being that big because most guys today can't even grow a decent beard. But during the Viking Age, from roughly 793 to 1066 AD, men were much smaller than they are now. And standing over 6 foot 6 inches, almost 7 foot tall, made Thorkell the Tall a true giant. In fact, he was such a big deal that kings on both sides paid him just to switch teams. He once fought for the English, then joined the Danes, then came back again. His loyalty was as fluid as his axe swing was deadly. As one chronicler put it, Thorkell fought for the highest bidder, but there was more to the giant than his size. He was quick and smart and cruel when needed. In one raid, he supposedly took down 40 men by himself. No wonder people prayed for mercy or death when Thorkell arrived. As with many legends, there's some debate as to when and where Thorkell the Tall actually lived. But he seems to have been active during the 10th century, coming from a region that today is part of Denmark and Germany. The son of a local chieftain, he had the blood of both Vikings and Anglo-Saxons in his veins, which may explain his later allegiance to both the English and Danish crowns. His size alone would have made him intimidating enough, but he also had a taste for theatrics. Before battles, he would dress up like a hairy wild man, complete with a horned helmet, and charge into battle brandishing an axe. At least one chronicler said he looked like a hairy wild man, and another said he wore a wolfskin and carried a huge battle axe. He struck terror into the hearts of his enemies before ever joining battle, and those who fought against him soon learned that there was no point in trying to outfight or outmaneuver him. He was strong enough to break a horse's leg with his bare hands, picked up a shield wall and hurled it over his shoulder like it was nothing. Even his enemies had to admit that he was a formidable warrior as well as a clever tactician and leader. The first time he appears in the historical record is in 986 AD. When he led a group of 2,000 men on a raid along the coast of what is today northern Germany and Denmark. The following year, he teamed up with a certain Eric the Victorious, whose fleet of 60 ships sailed to the Byzantine Empire and traded a bunch of slaves and then went home. Then in 990, Thorkell was mentioned yet again, this time leading a group of 5,000 men on a devastating raid into northern France. But it was under King Sweyn Forkbeard that Thorkell really made a name for himself. Sweyn was king of Denmark from 986 to 1014 and was known as a ruthless conqueror. Under his banner, Thorkell fought in England in the year 1000, 1002, and 1003. The apocryphal story goes that while fighting for the Danes against the English at the Battle of Malden in the year 1001, Thorkell was approached by a couple of English nobles who offered him a deal. They would pay him and his men to switch sides and join the fight against the Danes. So, in the middle of the battle, Thorkell turned coat and started hacking away at the English. As one English chronicler put it, Thorkell the Tall, after slaying many valiant warriors on both sides, ended the battle by slaying Elfhere for the Danes. After that, he kept switching sides, going back and forth between the Danes and the English until finally settling down, more or less in 1043 when he showed up at the Battle of Clontarf in Ireland. Fighting alongside the High King Brian Boru, Thorkell helped defeat a large force of Vikings led by his old pal Sven Forkbeard. He continued to live in Ireland for the rest of his life, or at least that's one version of the story. Another account says that he returned to Britain and became the Lord of the Isles, though it's unclear exactly which ones. Either way, he spent his last years far from his homeland, having made a name for himself as a giant warrior who had fought for pretty much everyone. He may not have been the greatest king or the most successful military leader, but few could deny that he was one of the most fearsome warriors of his age. And when you stood over 6 foot 6 inches tall, most people would rather die than fight you. So next time you see someone twice your size coming at you with an axe, remember to pray for mercy or death. For more about the Danes and their conquest of England, check out our series on the God of War. And for more about the Vikings, stay tuned for more information. There's a land so desolate, so frozen and forbidding that even its name means land of the dead. It is Greenland. Or at least it was named that by an Icelander. The year before, it had been called the Island of Wolves. But when Eric the Red showed up with a couple thousand followers, Looking for somewhere to build a settlement, all bets were off. Wolves, apparently. Eric didn't become famous by playing nice. He was exiled from Norway for murder, then again from Iceland, also for murder. And that's why he was looking for somewhere new to live, somewhere far away from the civilized world. See, back then, if you weren't Norwegian or Danish, you were basically nobody. And Eric wasn't looking to start another war. But when you're as tough as he was, peaceful living isn't really an option. So he headed north to a place that looked like this. First impressions? Not great. Just a big, scary, empty wasteland, but it was empty in a way that was kind of great. You know, like a whole continent waiting to be claimed. Of course, there was one problem. It was also pretty terrible. And I don't mean the weather. I mean, there was nothing here. There was nothing to eat, nowhere to hide, no trees to build houses, and no roads to get lost on. This place was a boondoggle. But Eric didn't care because it was empty. He started by naming the place Greenland, probably hoping that a good name would attract settlers. Then he divided the land into smaller districts and set out to conquer them. Or maybe he just set out to explore them. We're not sure because most of what we know about Eric comes from Icelandic sources, written about 400 years after he died. And they make him sound like an absolute badass. Like this passage describing how he fought a giant at the edge of the known world. Yes, it's exactly what it sounds like. Now, whether or not that story is true, what Eric did next is definitely real. He built a farm and invited some friends over for dinner. Ironic that the best evidence we have of his life comes from a church, right? But actually, that's not ironic at all. That's totally normal for a Viking. See, churches are just big stone buildings that Vikings used for everything except, going to church. In fact, when Eric died, he was buried in that very same church. Only problem is nobody knows where it is. Or maybe they do, but they not telling because that church is all that stands between us and a whole lost civilization. Because after Eric brought over a couple thousand settlers, they farmed, they fished, they built, they explored, and they lived for about 500 years until, well, we don't know exactly why they disappeared. Maybe it was climate change. Maybe it was the Black Death. Maybe it was both. But whatever happened, they left behind a landscape littered with their abandoned settlements and one very big question. Why? Why would anyone, even a murderer, want to live in such a desolate, frozen wasteland? Well, maybe they didn't have much of a choice. Maybe they were fleeing war or famine or, murder charges. But maybe they just wanted to get away from it all, from the politics, the drama, the gossip. Maybe sometimes running away is the only option you have. Problem is, it doesn't always work. Sometimes you run away and you just end up in a worse place. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't try. Sometimes running away is better than staying put. And sometimes running away can even lead to bigger things like empires. After all, it was the descendants of Eric the Red who founded the first European settlements in North America. Their leader, Leif Erikson, became the first European to set foot on the continent, about 500 years before Christopher Columbus. And he did it by sailing west from Greenland, which proves that if you have nothing to lose, you might as well go big or go home. Except maybe don't go home because chances are your problems will still be there waiting for you. Speaking of problems, my editor just told me we've got to wrap this up, so let's do it. Greenland may be the land of ice and snow, but it's also the land of opportunity. So next time you feel like you've got nothing to lose, just remember the story of Eric the Red and go forth and do stuff. Oh, and also bring a sweater. He is the stuff of nightmares, a giant serpent made of writhing snakes, a many-headed hydra ready to devour all in its path. And yet when explorers finally reached the fabled land of the snake people, all they found was a very real pit of very real snakes. Hi everyone. Today we're exploring the legends of the snake pit, the fearsome warriors who guarded it and the possible origins of one of history's most terrifying places. Maybe he was real. Maybe not, but the fear he inspired was real enough. Ragnar Lothbrok, the snake pit king. Historians estimate that between the years 860 and 873 AD, Ragnar Lothbrok terrorized England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire. His most famous raid was on Paris in 861, with a fleet of 120 ships. Ragnar and his band of Vikings descended on the city and demanded a massive ransom. When the king of West Francia, Charles the Bald, refused, Ragnar and his men pillaged the countryside for weeks. But Ragnar was no ordinary Viking. He wasn't motivated merely by greed or glory. He wanted to be a legendary warrior, a man who would be remembered through song and story long after he had died. And to that end, he crafted a persona, one that has echoed through the centuries and inspired countless tales of heroism and horror. According to the saga of Ragnar, Lothbrok was a descendant of Odin, the supreme god of the Norse pantheon. As such, he felt a great responsibility to live up to Odin's honorific ideals. And so he set out to accomplish what few other mortals had achieved. He traveled to the legendary land of the snakes, a place where giants ruled and where men could acquire magical powers, if they dared to enter the dreaded serpent pit, but this was no easy task. To reach the pit, Ragnar first had to get past the guardian of the underworld, Garmr, a monstrous dog with impenetrable armor and jaws of flame. Ragnar slew him with ease, but that was only the beginning. Next, he had to cross the rainbow bridge Bifrost, which connected the realm of the gods to the land of the living. Bifrost was guarded by Heimdall, a watchman whose all-seeing eyes never closed. Heimdall challenged Ragnar, but he too was no match for the Viking's mighty sword. Finally, Ragnar stood before the pit of snakes. It writhed and coiled around him, its many heads hissing and spitting venom, but Ragnar was prepared. He had brought with him the skin of a venomous serpent which he had boiled in tar. And so when the snakes lunged and their fangs sank into his flesh, he was protected. Now free from danger, Ragnar stepped into the pit and emerged moments later, transformed. Not only did he gain incredible powers, but he also received the undying love of the giant serpent, which from that moment on became his loyal mount. From there, Ragnar returned home, where he lived out the remainder of his days, ruling over his people and waging war against his enemies. Eventually, though, his luck ran out. While raiding in England, he was captured and thrown into a pit of snakes. This time, though, there was no magical protection to shield him from harm, and as the snakes bit into his flesh, he cried out in pain. But even in his final moments, he was defiant. He sang of Valhalla, the great hall in Asgard where fallen warriors were welcomed by Odin and feasted with the gods. He spoke of his deeds of valor and his undying spirit. And then, as the venom spread through his veins and the shadows closed in around him, he promised vengeance. Those words, more than any others, have echoed through time, inspiring awe and terror in equal measure. For Ragnar's sons, like Ivar the Boneless, went on to fulfill his promise in fire and blood, pillaging across Europe and striking fear into the hearts of all who heard his name. So, was Ragnar Lothbrok a real historical figure or just a figment of the Viking imagination? Maybe he was real, maybe not. But the fear he inspired was real enough. And the legacy of the Snake Pit King lives on in the stories that have survived from the Dark Ages and in the modern depictions of one of history's most terrifying places. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe and join our ever-growing community. Until next time, stay safe and stay curious.